Faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the Word of God. It's time for Faith to Live By with Sue Taylor.
Thank you for joining me today on Faith to Live By. This is Sue Taylor. We are in Psalm 74 today, and the title of this psalm is simply Remember. As we enter this psalm this morning, we will see that it is a psalm written by Asaph asking God to remember. It is a reflection backward, a reflection of the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians under the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. When the Babylonians were finished with their destruction of the temple, it seemed that God had forsaken his people once for all. In 6 different verses of this psalm, Asaph reminds the Lord that Israel is still the sheep of his pasture. Verse 1 says, "The sheep of his pasture, O God, why have you cast us off forever? Why does your anger smoke against the sheep of your pasture?" As the smoke rises from the debris the people see, it is as a smoking of God's anger. So in the plea of the psalmist, he asks God to remember your congregation, which you have purchased of old, the tribe of your inheritance which you have redeemed, this Mount Zion where you have dwelt. Not only is he reminding God that Israel is his sheep, but his congregation, the tribe of his inheritance. And then in verse 19, they are ascribed as his poor turtle dove. And verse 21, as the oppressed and the afflicted and needy. They are looking at the wreckage around them and calling out to God to remember that they are all these things to him, but at the same time wondering, how did this happen? Why was it allowed? But as you read further into this psalm, you see that the foreign invaders had stormed right into the middle of the holy place. And as verse 4 states, your enemies roar in the midst of your meeting place. They set up their banners or their signs. In other words, the invaders had introduced their heathen practices and idolatrous symbols in the place of the scriptural worship of Jehovah God. What Israel had experienced in the past was gone. As verse 9 explains, there were no miraculous signs or interventions by God. There was no prophetic voice. And worst of all, there seemed to be no hope. As they look at their plight, they say, "Nor is there any among us who knows how long this misery will last." Isn't there times you feel like this, beloved? If not in your personal situation or life, maybe more definitely when you look around at the world and its condition. But thank God, with him there is always hope, for he is, remember, the God of all hope. We always have to remember how faithful God has been in the past. And this is the psalmist, and he begins to recount God's faithfulness. Verses 12-17 is about finding hope and comfort in what God has done. It says, "For God is my king from of old, working salvation in the midst of the earth. You divided the sea by your strength. You broke the heads of the sea serpents in the waters. You broke open the fountain in the flood. You dried up mighty rivers." This is an account of God delivering the children at the Red Sea. It is so important that you and I have a history with God and the miraculous that he has performed on our behalf. I know many people no longer believe in the miraculous, but our God is the same God today as he was then. He is the ever-present, unchanging God of history. In the closing section of this psalm, the psalmist reminds God that his name has been reproached by the enemy as well, and that a foolish people has blasphemed his name. We read in verse 20, "Have respect to the covenant, for the dark places of the earth are full of the haunts of cruelty." We know God is a covenant-keeping God, and even though the earth has its dark places of evil, we are in the light. For back in verse 16 of this psalm it reads, "The day is yours, and the night also is yours. You have prepared the light and the sun." To apply this psalm to us today, beloved, would simply remember what God has done in the past. Trust Him to recall to your memory the times that He has delivered you and set you on high simply because you have known His good name. And when you pray, ask God to remember His honor and His good name on your behalf. This is why the psalmist ends this chapter with, "Arise, O God, plead your own cause." As God's people looked on the destruction they faced again, they could also look forward, because with God all things are possible. And with Christ as your Redeemer, remember that you too can tower over the wrecks of your life in the cross of Jesus Christ. Remember that this is your faith to live by when you call upon the God of heaven and ask Him to arise and plead your own cause. He will never fail you, child of God, and this you can count on.
You've been listening to Faith to Live By with Sue Taylor. If you would like to write with your comments or to request a copy of this program for an $8 donation, write Sue Taylor, 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850. Sue Taylor is a member of the KNEO team and a keynote speaker at several church and women's events throughout the 4-state area. To book Sue for your next event, contact Sky High Radio at 417-451-5636.